Now, Tucker is right about something. The Democrats have hoped that changing demographics will inure to their political benefit. Pundits like Steve Phillips, author of Brown is the New White, How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority, have traipsed the political circuit for years making this argument. And I hate it. In my view, people like Phillips are part of the rod at the center of the Democratic Party. They are responsible in significant part for its failures and are culpable in part for the rise of replacement theory. In a 2018 article at The Intercept, I criticized Phillips for arguing that America's growing non-white population is key to the Democratic Party's success, and that, quote, Democrats should not waste money appealing to white swing voters. The Democratic Party is useless today in part because it's been following Phillips's advice. For years now, the party has completely abandoned any effort to persuade voters of any race to pass the policies they actually want, or even to speak with them with a modicum of respect. Part of the reason is that advisors like Phillips, a senior advisor at top liberal think tank Center for American Progress, believe that white votes are a deplorable lost cause. And non-white voters, they think, will inevitably vote for Democrats, no matter how much the Democratic Party abuses them. Remember when Joe Biden told black voters in 2020 that if they didn't vote for him, they ain't black? That was just a Democrat saying out loud what so many of them believe, that non-white votes belong to them. They don't need to be earned. But they were wrong. As I wrote back then, though much is made of the browning of America, the country is still 70% white. And electoral strategies that are wholly dismissive of that population set themselves at an unnecessary disadvantage. America's browning is largely attributed to the fact that Hispanics constitute the largest growing ethnic group in the country. But a majority of Hispanics identify as white, and 1/3 continue to support Donald Trump. The irony is that Phillips's theory hasn't borne out. Democrats have so totally abandoned the working class, voters of all colors, that growing numbers of non-whites are looking for alternatives. Among Congress members, Republicans are the more vocal anti-interventionists right now. Marjorie Taylor Greene is out here outflanking squad members on the absurdity of giving aid to Ukraine while American babies starve. And Latinos are an important part of the Republican base. Now, this reality undermines Tucker's argument. Although he's right that Democrats hoped immigration changes would help them politically, they haven't. Not really. Not as much as people thought. Tucker doesn't have a strong electoral argument against immigrant populations who, on the whole, are more politically conservative and more religious than native-born Americans. And a slight liberal bias among first-generation immigrants disappears after a generation or two. They're ripe for Republican picking. And without the electoral case against immigration, I think it's fair to ask a hypothetical, as Tucker often does. What could be motivating him to see immigration as such an existential threat? Whose existence is really imperiled right now? The white American lifespan is declining right now for the first time in American history. The opioid pandemic is a scourge made worse by the COVID pandemic and the lack of universal health care. Wages haven't kept up with inflation, and both corporate parties are aligned against raising the minimum wage, even though we haven't had a minimum wage raise for the longest period in American history, and even though Americans have never worked harder for less. When Carlson focuses his ire on corruption by elites, he's right on the nose. But the fact that he fully understands that it's elite capture that's causing so many Americans to hurt right now makes it difficult for me to understand how he thinks that a relatively small and powerless immigrant group deserves as much focus as the billionaires stalling our wages, poisoning our baby food, and ruining the country. And focusing on small, powerless individuals rather than big corporations in control is dangerous, literally. We need to be clear about what people like the Buffalo shooter are talking about when he talks about the Great Replacement. They're not just talking about the natural immigration and population trends that have existed since the first immigrants walked out of East Africa. To replace something is to put something new in the place of something old. It implies the old thing is gotten rid of, not simply added to. The threat suggested by Great Replacement isn't just low white birth rates or average immigration rates. It's something more pernicious, something akin to white genocide. And in fact, the Buffalo murderer describes the declining birth rate as, quote, mass genocide. And genocide is defined as the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. That's not what immigrants do. That's what the Buffalo shooter did. He hunted down black people so they could be replaced with so-called legacy Americans, a term I find Kind of funny, given that few communities have as deep historical roots in America as Black Americans. After all, the Atlantic slave trade was abolished in 1808, meaning that the American descendants of slaves arrived here sometime before then. We predate the huge wave of European immigrants that arrived in this country between 1880 and 1920. 20 million immigrants arrived during those 40 years, nearly double the number of Africans forcibly enslaved and sold into bondage in the Americas over the span of 400 years. At this country's founding, Black Americans constituted 20% of the population and comprised 16.5% after the Civil War. But that didn't last long. By 1920, at the end of the great wave of European immigration, the original racial fabric of this country had changed. The legacy Americans, Black Americans, had largely been replaced. Now, I'm not sincerely arguing for a Black version of replacement theory. I'm drawing this historical analogy to make a point. The idea that rapidly changing demographics can politically disadvantage a population is nothing new, nor is the idea that some white Americans are so threatened by changing demographics that they feel empowered to murder Blacks, Jews, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans. Elites in this country have always understood that the best way to distract the public from their looting of wages and public wealth is to pit people against each other, to divide them up by their differences. Mainstream news pundits on both Fox and MSNBC would like to use racial strife as a deflection from core economic issues that hurt working people of all ethnic and national origins. That's why it's less important to focus on whether Tucker can be blamed for what happened in Buffalo and focus more on why there has been a proliferation of hateful rhetoric that makes working Americans see other powerless Americans as the source of their troubles. So much so that some folks resort to murder. We can't let this discourse replace important conversations about how we make this country live up to its ideals for all Americans together.
Well, back in January, there were numerous reports put out by outlets such as Bloomberg News and DW reporting that repeated booster doses of the COVID-19 vaccine could weaken the immune system. This news came after European regulators warned repeated COVID-19 doses could have the opposite effect of what was intended. Rather than strengthening the immune system against COVID-19, repeated dosing could cause the immune system to not just do nothing, but do the opposite. Here's Bloomberg News reporting. Repeat booster doses every 4 months could eventually weaken the immune response and tire out people, according to the European Medicines Agency. Instead, countries should leave more time between booster programs and tie them to the onset of the cold season in each hemisphere, following the blueprint set out by influenza vaccination strategies, the agency said. DW News reported the same thing, but also added statements from the WHO, which stated back in January that, quote, COVID-19 vaccines needed to elicit immune responses that are broad, strong, and long-lasting in order to reduce the need for successive booster doses. They also went on to say a vaccination strategy based on repeated booster doses of the original vaccine composition is unlikely to be appropriate or sustainable. Now, the Israelis also sounded the same alarm even earlier than the Europeans and the WHO. This past December, the New York Times reported, quote, weighing the potential benefits of another booster shot against the risks, some scientists, including a few on the Israeli advisory panel, have voiced concern that too many vaccinations might cause a sort of immune system fatigue, compromising the body's ability to fight the coronavirus, particularly among older people. But despite the warnings, the FDA and the CDC opted to authorize fourth doses of the vaccine for certain vulnerable populations anyway. The reason? Well, there just wasn't enough data showing a weakened immune response was a real threat. The data regarding the efficacy of the fourth dose was minimal, but so was any data that showed there would be any negative effects. The vaccine wears off, people are vulnerable and worried, the government decided to do something. Not to mention, there were subsequent reports that started to come out in February by outlets such as Reuters and USA Today that said the idea vaccines weaken the immune system was simply a conspiracy theory, that the vaccines do not weaken the immune system, but instead strengthen it. I wonder how the scientists at the European Medicines Agency, WHO, and the Israelis felt about being essentially categorized as conspiracy theorists. But, well, fast forward to now in May. It's been a few more months with many countries administering fourth doses of the vaccine. Here's Dr. Jennifer Ashton with Good Morning America talking about the latest data.
Dr. Ashton here. We were trying to get a handle on, yes, you got some new data on boosters.
There's a new published study out in Lancet, the journal Lancet Infectious Disease, about the 4th dose and what happens to our antibody levels. It is not a surprise that they've released new data confirming that after the 4th dose of Pfizer or Moderna, that antibody levels rise significantly. They surge in the several weeks after that dose. We've known that for a while, but here are the caveats. We don't know how long that lasts, number one. And our immune response, remember, is not just about antibodies. It's about that T-cell response also, which you can't really measure as well as just a pure antibody level. And it's about whether or not they're blocking or neutralizing antibodies to the variant that we're seeing. So when people hear these headlines, they shouldn't be surprised. Yes, of course, you're going to get a surge in your antibody levels, but how long that lasts is the issue. And it's certainly not just about more boosting for everyone. People who have high antibody levels, there's the potential. I want to underscore the potential. We haven't seen any evidence of this immune phenomenon known as tolerance, where if you already have high antibody levels and you get another booster, that your immune system can start to say, well, what am I needed for, and can kind of start to shut down.
Wow.
So if you're in that category of people who the FDA and CDC is recommending to get a booster, 50 and over, 65 and over with a chronic medical condition, yes, by all means, but everyone else, don't think that more boosting is the answer. We don't know that that's the case yet.
Okay, so they still don't know if boosting causes a weakened immune system, but they're still worried about it. It's a real concern. So if you're in a compromised category, by all means, do what you need to do to protect yourself. But for everyone else, they're saying, don't just think more is better. This, by the way, comes as the FDA has now given the green light to give the first round of booster shots to kids between 5 to 11 years old. The CDC still has yet to sign off on it, but with the amount of pressure put on regulatory agencies by parents and teachers unions, there's little doubt that they will authorize that 3rd dose for kids. So even though there's little data still out there, there is some, and I want to show it to you. So Walgreens keeps excellent records of who's catching COVID. They break down their tests into several categories: people who are unvaccinated, people who have had 1 dose, people who've had both doses of the vaccine within the past 5 months, people who've had both doses of the vaccine over 5 months ago, those who've had 1 booster within 5 months, and then those who had 1 booster over 5 months ago. And they don't have any data on those who've had the 2nd booster dose, but we can see a pattern from the data that we do have. So let's take a look here. So this graph shows us the percentage of tests that have come back positive in each category. And you can see that the unvaccinated and those who've had either their 2 doses or booster within the past 5 months are seeing about the same positivity rate of about 21%, although those who've had a booster within 5 months have a slightly higher positivity rate at 21.7%. Now, people who had 1 dose of the vaccine have a positivity rate of 26%. People who had 2 doses over 5 months ago have a positivity rate of 31.2%. And people who had 3 doses over 5 months ago have a positivity rate of 32.6%. Now, this graph shows the proportion of tests in each category and the percentage in each category that came back positive. So just this kind of just lets you look at it, the same sort of data, but from a different angle. You can see that the unvaccinated made up 23.9% of the total tests, but only 18.5% of the positive tests. Whereas the triple vaccinated over 5 months ago made up 30% of the tests, but 36.1% of the positive results. Now, what this doesn't show us is how severe the illnesses are. So even if you're more likely to catch COVID after the vaccine or booster wears off, what is unknown is whether or not it's severe. It matters a lot less if you're extra vulnerable to catching the virus if it presents like a cold, for example. And it matters a lot more if a weakened immune system also means having a tough time fighting off the disease. This part is the unknown at this point, but I imagine more data will come out soon enough.
And that's the explicit message of the article. It's hammered over and over again that expressing any concern about Yankovic and the Disinformation Governance Board was an act of sabotage by bad faith right-wing harassers against a noble public servant, a flawless individual. The Washington Post does not grapple with legitimate criticism of Yankovic. The article doesn't even acknowledge that any exist. Bad people oppose her in the Post framing, and if you oppose her, well, you're probably one of them. Yet there is good reason to be skeptical of both the Disinformation Governance Board and Yankowicz's fitness to run it. Informal efforts to police disinformation on social media are beset with serious challenges, as moderators and fact-checkers routinely make odious mistakes. Just yesterday, Facebook dubiously censored a recipe for homemade baby formula. That's something we're talking about on the show today. Government disinformation cops, they're no better. Time and time again, public health officials circulated false information about COVID-19 and suppressed perfectly legitimate discussions of the theory that the virus originated from a lab leak. When the New York Post reported on the salacious contents of Hunter Biden's laptop just weeks before the election, the story was widely dismissed by so-called disinformation experts and government security experts on grounds they presumed it to be Russian malfeasance. Quote, Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo, dozens of former intel officials say. That was the Politico headline in October 2020. Now, Yankowicz was one of those experts. She repeatedly made public statements indicating that she shared that view. She shared national security officials' high confidence that the Hunter Biden story was part of a Russian influence campaign. She described the idea that the laptop had been left behind at a repair shop as a fairy tale. This was a critical test of whether disinformation experts could keep their innate tendency to ascribe everything unfavorable to the Democratic Party as Russian nefariousness in check. And they utterly failed. You know what? Nina Jankowicz failed as well. So somewhere in Taylor Lorenz's article, amid the repetitive praising of Yankowicz's qualifications, anonymously sourced lamentations that DHS will no longer be able to recruit effectively, oh no, not that, and broad characterization of criticism as nothing more than sexist harassment, perhaps that failure deserved a mention. The article reads like it was ghostwritten by Yankowicz herself, which makes the underlying scoop less impressive. It's actually easy to get a government official to cooperate for a news article when the news article takes the form of PR.
Yeah, I can't disagree with this one at all. The problem is that even if there were a sliver of truth, I'm sure that she did receive some harassment.
Absolutely, no question.
Certainly she received pushback from the left and the right. Across the spectrum, people had these substantive concerns. What's so problematic is that you don't get to the substantive concerns, so we don't even have any space, you and I, to give any credence to the fact that maybe she was treated poorly in some corners of the internet, and maybe a little bit by us.
We did make fun of the TikTok videos.
It's good naturedly, but that's fundamentally the problem. And I see this happen over and over and over again. People believe that if they admit anything wrong they've ever done, or anything wrong when they're talking about a person that they otherwise like or support, that will undermine their entire credibility effort. And when it's the exact opposite, by acknowledging your opponent's point of view, by acknowledging the flaws in the person that you're trying to protect, you shore up your own credibility and you shore up theirs. And I don't understand why people don't get that. I think it's probably the best lesson that I learned in law school, is that you cannot ignore your opponent's arguments. It does you no benefit. Mm-hmm. All it does is make you look like you're either ignorant or you are misrepresenting the case, which is not a situation you want to be in when you're talking about a misrepresentation governance board.
And the fact that she got harassed, that she got violent threats, absolutely horrible, worthy of condemnation. The way, some aspects of the right wing attempt to discredit her, took the form of this kind of harassment, very bad. Absolutely agreed. But just getting harassment does not mean that you're without flaw or without sin, because everyone gets harassed. If we measure if receiving harassment means that you should not be criticized, you're on the right side. How is that? Because we all get harassment.
Right.
Anyone in the public life with an online presence who's participating in politics or commentary and is even remotely successful at attracting attention, positive or negative, to themselves, goes through this at some point. For women, it takes sometimes a specifically sexually violent, unpleasant.
Sure.
Absolutely, but men get death threats and threats of violence as well. I've gotten them. You've probably gotten them. That's just how it is. That's terrible. But it does not, because you're getting them, it doesn't mean that's your right.